Viewer discretion is advised. The night began like any other episode of late-night television. Warm studio lights, an audience settling into their seats, a host preparing for another predictable mix of jokes, applause, and celebrity promotion. But beneath that familiar surface, something else was brewing. Something colder. Something sharper. Salmon. Something no one in that room, producers included, was prepared to witness. For weeks, Jimmy Kimmel's team had been chasing one guest, a name they hadn't hosted in years. A name that didn't just draw viewers, it drew reverence. Kevin Costner. A man who didn't belong to the era of content. Wireless whose legacy was built in film canisters, not algorithms. Simmons 40 years in Hollywood and he had survived everything. Studio wars, critical backlash, box office storms, the rise of franchises, the collapse of genres. Not because he played it safe, but because he refused to. That refusal was the reason he was coming on the show tonight. Horizon, the passion project he had carved out of his own life, his own land, his own fortune. Crimson Chapter Western epic that executives dismissed as madness. Dismissed too long, too ambitious, too sincere for the modern age. He didn't ask permission. He mortgaged his property. He built the film with his own hands, his own money, his own conviction. And tonight was supposed to be the night he finally told the world why. But while Kevin was preparing to talk about legacy, Jimmy's writers were preparing something else. Not questions, not insight, slamming, not conversation, material. Material built around the same tired punchlines that had followed Kevin like a shadow for decades. Wireless, Waterworld, Sentenced, Titanium, flops. The idea that ambition equals foolishness, that risking everything for art is funny, that an entire life's work is just set up for a joke. In the pre-show meeting, one writer had said exactly what the others were thinking. Waterworld jokes always go viral. Another added, if Horizon bombs, it'll be Waterworld on land. Laughter filled the room. The kind Kevin had heard from the sidelines his entire career. Small laughter, cramped laughter. The kind that grows in rooms where nothing is at stake. Didn't shut it down. He didn't question the angle. He didn't push for respect. He just nodded along. Because sometimes the easiest laugh feels safer than the honest conversation. Meanwhile, backstage, Kevin Costner was adjusting his collar, brushing desert dust from the sleeve of his jacket. The same jacket he wore while scouting locations for Horizon. He wasn't thinking about jokes. He wasn't thinking about mockery. He was thinking about the film, the story, the years he'd poured into it. He believed he was walking into a conversation about art. He didn't know he was walking into an ambush. The stage manager gave him the cue. The band hit the opening beat. Jimmy Kimmel announced him with a familiar smile, the same polished delivery used for every guest, big or small. Please welcome Kevin Costner. Not forced, not polite, genuine. Because even if modern Hollywood had forgotten what a movie star looked like, Throttle hadn't. The world hadn't. Stepped into the light with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove, except the thing he cared about most. Horizon. The story he built from sweat, risk, and stubborn faith. He shook Jimmy's hand. He sat down. He smiled. And somewhere in the back row, a producer whispered to another, "This is gonna be good." They had no idea how right they were. but not for the reasons they thought. Kevin settled into the chair with the ease of a man who had sat in hundreds of them. But tonight, something felt different. He couldn't name it yet, but he felt it. Faint tightness in the air. Crimson tension beneath Jimmy's smile. The kind you only notice when you've lived long enough to trust your instincts. Jimmy opened with what seemed like a respectful introduction. Awards, legacy, ambition, the scale of Horizon. Sidelines applauded, proud to witness a living piece of cinema history sitting just a few feet away. Then came the first question. So, Horizon, 4 films, nearly 3 hours each, shot back to back. That's insane. Kevin leaned forward, ready to speak from his heart. It's a story that needs space, he said. These characters, the landscape, the era, you can't compress all of that into 2 hours. The frontier wasn't small. The human cost wasn't small. If you're going to tell it right, you have to let it breathe. The audience listened, quiet, drawn in by the sincerity. For a moment, it felt like the conversation Kevin had hoped for. Did Jimmy slid in the first blade? So you also mortgaged your property to finance it, right? It was the tone, not the question, the tone. Chine pointed curiosity wrapped in a smirk. Laughter rippled, not cruel, but uncertain. The kind of laugh people give when they think they're supposed to. Kevin didn't smile. Yes, he answered calmly, because I believe in it. Sometimes that's what artists do. Sometimes that's what real storytelling demands. Nodded, but the glint in his eyes changed. Kevin recognized it instantly. He'd seen it in studio boardrooms, journalist interviews, award show monologues. When curiosity turns into condescension. That's admirable, really, Jimmy said. But Kevin, you've done this before. Bet everything on a big vision. Gone way over budget. I mean, Waterworld, basically. Kevin didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift in his chair. He didn't break eye contact. He simply said, "Stop right there." The audience froze. The band fell silent. The air thinned so suddenly you could feel the pressure drop. Zim blinked, caught off guard. Just saying, there's a pattern, right? A pattern of me making the films I believe in, Kevin replied, his voice low, steady, unmistakably serious. Salmon, called regardless of what people like you think about them. That line hit the room like a steel door slamming shut. A few audience members gasped. Shields' coach exchanged glances. No one laughed. Jimmy tried retreating behind humor, the most common shield in late-night television. Come on, Kevin, I'm just joking around. No, Kevin said. Crimson said, You're not. For a brief second, Camera 3 zoomed in on Jimmy's face. A flicker of panic, barely hidden under a forced smile. Kevin continued, You're doing what people have done to me for decades. Reducing risk to recklessness, ambition to arrogance, courage to comedy. You're not asking questions, you're setting up punchlines. Jimmy looked toward the audience for support. Nothing. The silence wasn't hostile. It was anticipatory, the kind you hear before a storm breaks. I didn't mean disrespect, Jimmy tried again. What did you mean? Kevin asked. The weight of that question pulled the entire room into stillness. Because you brought up Waterworld, which has been used to mock me for 30 years. You brought up budgets, which implies irresponsibility. You framed my commitment to my vision as a flaw. Tell me, Jimmy, what part of that wasn't meant to be disrespectful? The audience shifted, uneasy. Shields couldn't their arms. Some leaned forward. Some held their breath. It was no longer an interview. It was an indictment. Cameras caught everything. Pause the tremble at the corner of Jimmy's mouth, assaulting the slight clench of Kevin's jaw. The realization dawning on millions of screens that this wasn't scripted tension, was real. And they were only at the start. The felt colder now, not because the air conditioning changed, but because Kevin Costner had shifted the temperature of the entire room simply by refusing to play along. Stiffness in the audience could feel it. An invisible line had been crossed, and Jimmy was standing on the wrong side of it. Jimmy adjusted his cue cards, tapping them against the desk like he could somehow reset the moment. Okay, he said with a shaky laugh. Maybe I pushed a little too hard. But come on, Kevin, Waterworld was a little... Kevin didn't let him finish. Say it, he said quietly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The calmness was sharp enough. Jimmy swallowed. Over the top. Over the top, Kevin repeated, studying him. You think ambition is over the top? That risking everything for something you believe in is funny? That the people who build worlds, who take chances, who put their soul on the line, exist so you can recycle a joke from 1998? Murmured, soft, unsettled. No laughter. Redskins. Just the sound of a collective shift in loyalty. Kevin leaned back, eyes still locked on Jimmy. You know what's actually funny? He continued. Waterworld cost $175 million and made over $260 million worldwide. That's called a profit. But the narrative that I failed was easier for people like you. Easier than admitting someone swung big and didn't crash. Jimmy opened his mouth, but Kevin kept going. Measured, unhurried, devastating. That film employed hundreds of people. It pushed technical boundaries. It built an entire world from nothing. And for decades, I've listened to people who've never created anything reduce it to a punchline. The audience sat absolutely still, hanging on every word. Jimmy tried to find safer ground. Look, I'm not saying your work isn't impressive. You're just mocking what you don't understand, Kevin said. And maybe you don't have to understand, but you could at least respect it. Jimmy shifted in his chair, losing the rhythm he relied on for every interview. Kevin, you're being a little sensitive. Thickness. Refreshed through the room like broken glass. Kevin's expression didn't change. If anything, he grew calmer. Stiffness. Simmons. Grounded. That, he said softly, misinformation is what people say when they don't want to take responsibility for being cruel. Jimmy looked genuinely rattled now. Kevin continued, his voice steady and unshakable. You think sensitivity is a weakness? Let me tell you what sensitivity actually is. It's knowing what it costs to create something real. It's understanding that risk takes courage. It's recognizing that mockery is cheap and art is not. He paused, not for dramatic effect, but because truth sometimes needs a breath before it lands. You sit behind a desk, he said, and judge the people who build the things you joke about. You comment, you ridicule, but you don't risk anything. You don't put yourself on the line. You don't know what it means to try and fail publicly. Jimmy's cheeks flushed. Not from anger, from exposure. For the first time, Kevin leaned slightly forward. You want to talk about patterns? Here's a pattern. Artists create. Comedians comment. Tattoos, one requires courage, the other requires convenience. A few people in the audience actually applauded, short, hesitant claps that quickly spread into something much louder. Jimmy raised a hand, trying to regain control. Hey, this is my show, okay? Let's keep the energy light. with a tired kind of disappointment. You could have asked me about Horizon, have asked about the belief it takes to make a film like that. But instead you chose the easiest joke in the world. Jimmy tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. Kevin, I swear I didn't mean to insult your taste in comedy. It wasn't abrupt. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, disimbisive, the kind of movement that ends a chapter. The audience gasped. Camera operators shifted, scrambling to adjust. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered, "Oh no, don't cut away, keep rolling." Kevin unclipped his microphone with calm precision. "I'm not here to be the punchline of your writers' meeting," he said. "I'm here to talk about the story I risked everything to tell. And if that's not what this show is interested in, then I'm done." Jimmy stood too, panic creeping into his voice. "Wait, Kevin, don't walk off. You can't just leave." Kevin looked at him with a small, exhausted smile. "Watch me." The audience erupted, not in laughter, not in shock, but in applause. Loud, wrongful, rising, authentic. Jimmy's face went pale. His show was no longer in his hands. Kevin took a breath, sweeping his gaze across the audience, then back to Jimmy. "You had one of the last real movie stars on this stage," he said. "And instead of asking about the work, you chose the cheapest joke you had." He placed the microphone gently on the chair. "And that's why I'm leaving." He turned toward the edge of the stage. Whole step. 2. The studio held its breath. What no one realized, not the audience, not the crew, not even Jimmy, Costner walked away. Jang, the entire cultural conversation about art, risk, and mockery was about to change. Kevin's boots hit the edge of the stage with a steady rhythm, not angry, not rushed, just final. The kind of finality that makes everyone who witnesses it realize they're watching history happen in real time. Jimmy took a desperate step forward. "Kevin, come on, don't be like this, we're just having fun." Kevin stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He let the words hang there, thin, hollow, flimsy things collapsing under their own weight. Then he faced Jimmy. "Fun?" he asked quietly. The room tightened again, a bowstring pulled to its limit. "That's the word people use when they hurt someone and want to pretend they didn't," Kevin said. "Fun. Lighten up. Don't take it personally. As if the problem is the person being mocked, not the person doing the mocking." Jimmy opened his palms, appealing to the audience. "Don't you think you're overreacting a little? I mean..." Kevin cut him off, not harshly, but with the clarity of someone who has finally run out of patience. "You know what's interesting, Jimmy? When comedians get critiqued, they call it censorship. When artists defend themselves, comedians call it being sensitive. Either way, the comedian never takes responsibility." Aaron wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. They weren't whispering about drama anymore. They were whispering about truth. Jimmy tried again, leaning on the instinct that had saved him in 1,000 interviews. Crimson. "Kevin, please, sit down, man. We can fix this." The plea was genuine. The damage? Already done. Kevin stepped closer to him, not intimidating, but towering in presence. "I've taken jokes for 40 years. Jokes about my films, my choices, my risks. And I've heard them told by people who actually accomplished something, people who created art of their own, who knew what courage costs." His eyes locked onto Jimmy's. "You're not one of them." The audience let out a collective breath, slashing away between shock and realization. Jimmy's face twitched, not in anger, but in recognition. Because even he couldn't pretend the line wasn't true. When's the last time you put your own money into something you believed in? Kevin asked. When's the last time you risked anything that mattered? Your reputation, your security, your comfort? Jimmy had no answer. Misinformation. He knew it. The audience knew it. Kevin knew it. Silence filled the studio. Total, heavy, undeniable. Kevin continued anyway, his voice lower now, almost compassionate. You mock the people who risk. Punishable is easier than creating, than trying, crimson than failing. He turned toward the camera, the one pointed straight at the millions watching at home. Horizon might fail, he said, calm and steady. It might lose money. Critics might tear it apart. People might call it another Kevin Costner misstep. His expression didn't waver. And I'll survive that. Windshield at something ambitious is still better than succeeding at something safe. The room erupted into applause, real applause, impartial, not prompted, not cued, not encouraged. Jang looked around, stunned, as if the room had suddenly turned against him. Continued, speaking not to Jimmy, not to the audience, but to anyone who had ever tried and been mocked for it. At least I'll have tried. At least I'll have believed in something enough to risk everything. And when I look back at my life, I'll know I built something. Can you say the same? Lips parted, but no sound came. Kevin wasn't waiting for an answer. Harris, he reached the steps leading off the stage. The band stayed frozen. Cameras kept rolling. Missions didn't dare cut to commercial. Just before disappearing backstage, Kevin looked back one last time. I hope someday you try to create something that matters. And I hope no one treats your effort with the disrespect you showed mine tonight. And with that, he was gone. The studio sat in stunned silence. Jimmy stumbled back to his desk, like a man who had just witnessed the collapse of something he didn't fully understand yet. He tried to joke. He tried to smile. He tried to salvage the moment. But his voice shook. His jokes fell flat. Jang wasn't with him anymore. Because respect, once broken publicly, rarely returns the same way. And by the time the cameras finally cut to commercial, guardians on that studio and everyone watching at home knew. Light television had just changed. Armstrong had just changing. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the studio fractured into chaos. Blinds producers scrambling. Righteousness whispering. Stage managers frozen in place, unsure whether to chase after Kevin or pretend nothing had happened. Tensions murmuring in loud, confused clusters, some stunned, some thrilled, all aware they had witnessed something rare. Jimmy stood beside his desk, staring at the empty chair Kevin had left behind, flooring the microphone still resting where he'd placed it. Neat. Deliberate. Like a signature. A producer rushed to Jimmy's side. "We can spin it," she whispered. "We'll say it was playful tension, just a bit that got out of hand." Jimmy didn't respond, because even he knew nothing about what just happened could be spun. Jimmy could be spun. Kevin Costner hadn't stormed out like a diva. He hadn't snapped or thrown a fit. Simmons, he had dismantled an entire late-night ecosystem with calm, precise truth. The kind nobody in that building had been prepared to face. When the show returned from commercial, Jimmy tried to push through the next segment, but his smile looked disconnected. Spinach, his jokes landed like bricks. Every to revive the energy only highlighted how thoroughly the atmosphere had collapsed. He was speaking, but the audience wasn't with him anymore. Something had shifted. By the time the credits rolled, Jimmy knew it. The staff knew it. The audience knew it. The only person who didn't seem shaken, who walked away intact, was the one who had left early. Outside the studio, a cluster of fans waited near the exit. They hadn't expected anything more than a glimpse of Kevin as he headed to his car. What they got instead was a moment they'd talk about for years. Crimson stepped out, Kevin stepped out into the night, the headline lights of Hollywood Boulevard reflecting off his jacket. He wasn't smiling triumphantly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rattled. Peaceful. Someone in the crowd called out, "We saw it! You were right to walk!" Kevin didn't grandstand. He didn't wave. He didn't feed the frenzy. He just nodded once, acknowledging the sentiment, but not indulging it. Because tonight hadn't been about ego. It had been about dignity. His SUV door opened, and just before he stepped inside, he paused. A young, aspiring filmmaker, barely 20, stood at the front of the crowd, clutching a cheap camera, eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Costner," he said nervously, "does it ever get easier, taking risks?" Kevin looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said softly, "but it becomes more important." And then he left. Within minutes, the internet detonated. Emissions from the confrontation spread across every platform imaginable. Missions watched the moment Jimmy tried to joke, and Kevin refused to shrink. Missions more watched Kevin's final words, his calm explanation of why he was walking, his defense of courage, had refusal to laugh at disrespect. The hashtag Kevin walks, hashtag respect creators, hashtag late night is dead. Artists from every field, directors, writers, actors, musicians, began posting their support. One director wrote, "Kevin Costner didn't walk out. He stood up." Another added, "Mocking someone says more about the mocker than the artist." Even people who weren't fans of Kevin's films recognized the bigger truth. Light comedy had stopped being playful. It had become dismissive, Simmons, cynical, cruel. And Kevin had called it out on the largest stage possible. Articles exploded overnight. Entertainment Weekly. Kevin Costner's walkout wasn't a meltdown, it was a masterclass in boundaries. Variety. Deflated night under fire after Costner confrontation. The Hollywood Reporter. Costner's exit sparks industry debate. Is mockery the new default? Celtics publicists for major stars pulled back their bookings. Studio heads whispered about the Kimmel incident. From competing shows saw an opportunity to position themselves as the respectful alternative. And Jimmy? Jimmy issued a statement, not an apology, a justification, crimson, a clarification, a vague blend of excuses that only made things worse. People didn't want an explanation. Ambers of the Writers Guild didn't get it, and the comment sections made that clear. Meanwhile, Kevin continued his press tour without missing a beat. He sat for long-form interviews with journalists who asked real questions. He spoke passionately about Horizon, the characters, the American history behind the story, the stakes of making a film the old-fashioned way. Every appearance felt meaningful. Every conversation felt genuine. He's generous, open, princessed. The walkout didn't overshadow Horizon. It amplified it. Because now people weren't just talking about the film, they were talking it existed, why it mattered, Why someone would mortgage their land just to bring a story to life. Over the next week, something surprising happened. Kevin Costner became a symbol, of controversy, not of anger, but of artistic courage. People who had been mocked for dreaming too big, students, painters, small filmmakers, creators of every kind, saw themselves in what he did. They weren't cheering for drama. They were cheering for dignity. Late-night comedy had spent years punching down, but Kevin had punched back. Not with insults, not with cruelty, not with theatrics, but with truth. Calm, clear, unshakable truth. By the time Horizon premiered, the narrative had shifted completely. People weren't asking whether the film would succeed. They were asking whether the world deserved artists like Kevin Costner. And somewhere in a studio office, Jimmy Kimmel replayed the footage. The moment he crossed the line. The moment he realized it. And the moment Kevin walked. He stared at his own face, frozen on the screen, caught between a smirk and a regret he couldn't hide. Because deep down, he knew. He hadn't lost a guest. He hadn't lost a segment. He hadn't lost an interview. He'd lost something bigger. Restrictions. And Kevin Costner? He returned to his ranch, dust on his boots, script pages under his arm, preparing for the next chapter of Horizon the same way he always had. With risk, with heart, impartial, with integrity. Because real artists don't create for approval. They create because something inside them refuses not to. And that, than the walkout, more than the debate, more than the trending hashtags, is why Kevin Costner will outlast every joke, every critic, every late-night punchline. Some legacies are built on laughs. Others are built on courage. Kevin Costner chose courage. And the world finally noticed.